Van?
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I asked this of the Foreign Minister yesterday, but can you tell the committee from a trade point of view, what are Australia's national interests?
Well, it's a very broad question.
It is.
Senator Van, and I'm not sure how Senator Foreign Minister Wong answered it, but our national interests are all of the things in a trade space that we would want to do to increase the prosperity of our people. To give you an example, as you might recall, when we came to government 2 years ago, we had $20 billion worth of impediments with China, our largest trading partner, and we've worked steadily to reduce that figure. Now, I would say that is something in our national interest. We're trying to negotiate a free trade agreement, for instance, with the United Arab Emirates. If that's successful, then of course that means our trade gets in at a lower tariff into that country, and again, that's in our national interest. So I would think anything that in trade that increases our prosperity is in our national interest.
So generally exports would help our prosperity?
Yeah, so all the evidence is that if you work in an export-focused industry, you're likely to be earning more money than if you work in a non-export focused industry. Just to give you an example.
That's a very good point, actually.
When we got the barley back into China late last year, the week I was in Western Australia for the first shipment of barley back to China, the week before, barley had been selling at $300 a tonne. For that 40,000 tonnes, it was worth $375 a tonne. So, it's all about
demand and supply.
Demand and supply, but getting extra value for Australian products if you're exporting it overseas.
Thank you, Minister. Very good points. And you'll think these are questions for tomorrow's Department of Defence, but I'd like your read on them. The DSR and the NDS both talk about the government taking a whole-of-government approach to defending Australia. Would you see that trade has a role in that?
Well, to this extent that if I'm right about my earlier supposition that trade brings with it prosperity, I think that's prosperity adds to the defence of the country. Secondly, what trade does is it entwines economies.
Yeah.
Day after tomorrow, I'm going to Singapore to sign some agreements in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with 14 countries in our region. I think the more countries are entwined economically, the less likely there is to be disputation or fighting, and therefore the safer our region and the world should be.
Thank you. Would you agree with me that exports of defence products and capability is an important part because it takes pressure off your budget, because our sovereign industrial base can sell overseas for the premium you talked about?
Right.
You'd see that as an important part.
Australia Australia supports the exports of our wonderful defence products. And,
through EFA?
Well, EFA is one outlet for it, but of course, we're about to build some submarines in South Australia.
We're not exporting them?
We may not export the submarines themselves because we'll be needing them for our own defence purposes. But I think some of the technologies that will emerge from the construction of those submarines will be things that we can sell to the world, and I'd certainly be encouraging companies, if they have, as I think they will be, world-beating technologies, to explore the possibility of exporting them.
Terrific. Mr Hopkins, just reflecting on what the Minister has had to say, what's your view of, as the CEO of EFA, what's your view of national interest?
Senator, look, national interest is very dynamic, and for an agency like ourselves, it's not a policy agency, really that's a matter for government to determine. And the government has asked us to focus particularly on the defence export sector, and it has given us a facility to help do that on the national interest account. But we also have a number of other levers that we control to help support the defence sector. We have our own commercial account, so we conduct financing on a commercial basis. And as the Minister had rightly pointed out, AUKUS, we think, is going to provide a lot of opportunity for Australian business. And part of those opportunities will be, once those smaller businesses move into the global supply chains of the larger primes, they will need finance to do that. And that in itself will create a lot of opportunities for them. So we're already talking to some of the major banks about their strong relationships with the defence primes and how we might help support some of the smaller businesses to access some of that work that's going to happen down the track. I also think from an international perspective, we're working very closely as well with our agencies or sister agencies in the UK and the US on opportunities to co-finance transactions together, and also to see that whether or not we can cooperate on support for some of their businesses setting up shop here in Australia that, again, eventually may export. So we see it as a fairly dynamic offering, not just on the national interest account, but also crowding in others, using our commercial account, and also stretching out into opportunities to work alongside partners in the private sector.
Thank you. So on looking at your annual reports, in the year 2019-20, you did, on the national interest account, you did 18 transactions worth $675 million, supporting $700 million in overseas contracts. It's not a bad year. In 2021, you did $166 million in transactions, supporting $147 million in overseas contracts. Not so good. Really good year in 2021, $4.5 billion, supporting $8.7 billion in overseas contracts. Very good year. 2022-23, only 3 transactions worth $333 million, supporting $118 or nearly $119 million in overseas contracts. Probably not your best year. Would any of those, is that multiplier, is that taken into account in the national interest when you're assessing an application for a national interest loan?
So when we're assessing our success, it really comes down to not just the finance that we provide, but, as you say, the amount of export dollars that we're actually supporting. So often you can be providing $10 million in bonding support for what could be a $100 million contract. So yes, we do assess that sort of multiplier effect. I think looking at some of those yearly figures, we are having some of the best and most successful years that we've had over the past couple of years on our commercial account. We had our best commercial account year in a very long time last year, and we're already in our project and structured finance business up to $1 billion worth of transactions already this year. So it's going to be, thankfully, another very good year. And again, a good year for us means supporting more Australian business and more Australian exporters. So we are very focused on achieving success on both the national interest account, but also providing real commercial opportunities where that we can not only help support a business but ensure that government gets a return on the money that it invests in those businesses, and to grow the agency and to grow the support that we can provide.
So, in taking your word on that, a loan application for, let's say, $50 million that was secured against overseas contracts worth $1.2 billion, would that come off the commercial account or the national interest account?
Senator, it really depends. We look at transactions on a case-by-case basis, so we have to assess different risks. It would depend on which sector it was in, depend on which country it would be in. It would depend on the nature of the company itself, their management team, their capabilities, whether or not there were any other issues or departments we needed to consult in terms of approvals we might need to obtain. So I can't give you every transaction, unfortunately, that we end up doing tends to be very bespoke, and because we are a market gap financier, effectively we step in when commercial finance can't be provided. So there is a lot of complexity to the transactions that we do. So I can't really answer that question without knowing specific details of a transaction.
Well, I assume you have been briefed on it, but what's the typical timeframe for assessing an application?
Senator, we can do transactions fairly quickly, but we've had transactions in our pipeline for many, many years. Particularly the larger transactions, we identify them early. We work through some of the early stage financing requirements that they're going to need, some of the feasibility studies that need to be obtained. So we can have transactions tracking on our system for a long time before we actually come in and provide the end product, which is the finance.
And would you consider a $50 million loan small, medium or large loan?
$50 million is a medium-sized loan for us. It comes with considerable sort of risk. I mean, we've got a relatively skinny balance sheet. If I was to lose $50 million, that would be a reasonable amount of money, given that we make sort of $17, $18 million a year profit. So medium to large.
So, and someone in here would probably ask you questions on that. Just reading those figures that I read out to you before, you said they're supporting X million dollars in overseas contracts. Do you take overseas contracts for, with national governments or other worthy things? Do you use that as a criteria for assessing the viability of a loan on either account, commercial or
it's one of the many benchmarks that we use, but it's not exclusively the single benchmark. It's a range of issues that we look at.
Okay. There is a particular loan that is outstanding, that it's been on your books for at least 9 months now. It is to support manufacturing of ammunitions. It's acquiring IP from a overseas company, and it will facilitate building Australia's guided weapons and explosive ordnance capabilities. Will accelerate that far faster than GUIO ever will. I struggle to see how EFA is supporting the national interest on that whole of government approach when your team seem to be dragging their heels, kicking and screaming on this one particular loan.
Senator, I'm familiar with the transaction you're referring to. We wouldn't normally talk about our company's name in a forum like estimates. But look, I can assure you that we are continuing to engage with that company actively, and there was engagement on Thursday and there's been further engagement today. So it certainly is not a transaction that is lagging on our books. It's very much front of mind, and one that we are continuing to focus on assessing whether or not we are able to assist the company in question.
Okay, I'll leave it there, Chair. But Mr Hopkins, I hope you can hurry that one along. There's a lot of good around the world.
Thanks.
Waiting
Thanks
for
a lot, Senator Van.